Welcome to the only daily podcast focusing on compliance news of the day. Each morning, start your day with a cup of coffee and Tom Fox, the voice of compliance, to hear about 4 of the top compliance, corruption, or leadership stories you will need to start your day. The Daily Compliance News is a production of the Compliance Podcast Network.
First, a word from our sponsor. The Daily Compliance News for December 6, 2021, the Defense of Contradictions edition. We begin with that story from the Wall Street Journal as the defense has now concluded its presentation of Elizabeth Holmes, and she's been cross-examined, and one can only conclude, as the Journal did, it's a defense of contradictions. She tries to show that she was abused physically and mentally, while making clear that she's in charge of her own agenda, down to the level of 15-minute detail and notes she kept to herself, as well as she's in charge of Theranos. So she said, quote, "I do everything I say word for word." So it's going to be interesting to see if the defense's attempt to confuse the issues in front of them by putting on a lot of really nonsensical and extraneous testimony in the defense of Holmes will help get her off. Next up from the FT, the imposter syndrome is still here, as competence does not guarantee confidence. So what can you do if you have the imposter syndrome? Well, it's blamed for many mental health problems, as well as stopping many people, including women and minority groups, from reaching their potential. There's evidence that it fades with time, but there's a case for rethinking attitudes to the imposter syndrome. A lack of confidence is a blight. Its flip side, complacency and conceit, are more damaging still. So people still struggle with this, and I hope you can work through it if you do. Next up from the New York Times Deal Book, we are here to Web 3.0. Crypto enthusiasts see a future where the internet runs on blockchain tokens. So from the compliance perspective, what does this mean for you? Well, it means that you better start learning a little bit about this, because you may well have to deal with this in the context of doing due diligence on third parties, dealing with third parties. It may be a part of your third-party relationship. One of the promises of blockchain is to give greater transparency, so this could be a plus, but it also could be used for opaqueness. So as a compliance professional, how are you going to deal with blockchain in your company? And finally, last week we talked about the delisting by the Chinese company Didi. Well, this comes on the heels of the Securities and Exchange Commission disclosed that Chinese companies had to report whether they were owned or controlled by a government entity and provide greater evidence of auditing. This is something that Chinese companies obviously do not want and have been notorious for not following U.S. rules when they list on U.S. stock exchanges. So a welcome initiative for more transparency from the SEC. The Daily Compliance News is a production of the Compliance Podcast Network and a proud member of C-Suite Radio. Thanks so much for listening. I hope you'll join me again tomorrow.
This podcast is a part of the C-Suite Radio Network. For more top business podcasts, visit c-suiteradio.com.